2 years after the Adan trilogy, the sequel has now released. Welcome to the Book Binge. I am your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and today we are covering While Darkness Gathers by Dear Dr. Fantasy himself, Philip Chase. Thank you to Philip, first of all, for sending me the copy of this book, and sorry it took me so long to read it. I legit thought that I would be able to read it at the end of June, early July, somewhere in that range pretty shortly after it got to me. It ended up being late July, early August instead, so again, I apologize for that. And even the reading that I did do of this there in late July should have been able to finish it just that month, but then I had a week of just binging Claire Obscura Expedition 33, which kind of broke that up. So, you know, the way things go. More on that game on the second channel probably tomorrow, by the way. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Oh, dropping a book over here. My apologies. To get back on topic, While Darkness Gathers is the sequel to the Adan trilogy, and I really enjoyed Adan when I read it a couple of years ago, kind of as those books were releasing, or, you know, shortly-ish after they were releasing, because I kind of got a little bit later each time as those books were coming out. But in 2023, that trilogy came out. I really enjoyed it. Return to Adan, especially the third book of it, wound up being, I believe, my number 2, but maybe my number 3 favorite book of 2023, so, you know, pretty good job done there, Mr. Chase. As a result, I've been kind of looking forward to Philip's next offering, just looking forward to seeing what it was going to be. I kind of knew that it was going to be in the Adan world. I believe he had revealed that to me on the discussion that I had had with him following reading the whole trilogy a couple years ago. There was also the thought that this book might end up coming out last year, but either way, it was still a quick enough turnover, and I enjoyed the book. With that being said, let's jump into the review proper and start things off with the good. And I gotta praise some of the things that I feel like I probably praised a good bit about Adan a couple of years ago, although I don't fully remember the specifics of all of that. Creating very human characters, once again, is one of the things that I enjoyed about While Darkness Gathers the most. Some of the characters from the Adan trilogy do return in this one, but there are some notable new characters in this one as well, and all of them still feel real, or now feel real in the case of the new characters. That is really great. Particularly of note is the character motivations kind of involved with everybody. Those generally tend to make a lot of sense, and I enjoyed being able to read all of that, and also kind of going along with that motivation idea, the decision making and the dynamics between everybody is also fairly fantastic. You get a really good sense of where characters are in their relationships with one another. That makes for a great storytelling, and also for some other stuff that we'll talk about here in just a minute. There's also an aspect to this book that I really enjoyed that I can't really talk about properly without spoilers, so I'll just kind of say that the conflict plots are really good in the intricacies of them. The little bit more like political and or moral dilemmas associated with some of them is rather intriguing to read about. It coincides a little bit more with the general political dynamics that Philip created for Adan, and the way that those have shifted in the time since Adan, because this is of course a sequel to that series. It's, 16 years after the Adan trilogy. So you get to see implicitly a little bit of the way that some of those dynamics have changed and how even those are affected by what's now going on in this book. Really enjoyable time. Another great thing about While Darkness Gathers is the fact that it's so short. For epic fantasy, having a book that doesn't even hit 300 pages is super refreshing. Philip easily, with this story that he's got going on in here, could have made this like a Return to Adan sized book, and easily been able to justify it as well, but he decided not to. He decided not to indulge in all of that because he knew that he could make the story brief, and so he did, and that ended up working out. And part of the way that ended up working out is the way that POV allocation and the switching between them is handled in the book, which is super effective, and I really liked that about it. If you enjoyed the way that POVs are handled in, say, Valor or Wrath from Faithful and the Fallen by John Gwynne, those two books have very short chapters that flip between POVs rather constantly, and I think that is really good for this story because you get to see each character's thoughts as they're kind of going on and jumping between different steps of the journey. The way that the timeline is also enhanced by this. Again, we'll talk a little bit about that in just a second. Was also really great, and this is in comparison to the Adan trilogy, where a couple of those books have frequently pretty lengthy chapters, somewhere in that 20 to 30 page range. Like Return to Adan, I think the average chapter length is over 20 pages. And even though several of those chapters have multiple scenes that switch between POVs, it's a little bit harder to keep track that way, for me anyway. This book, every new chapter is a different POV. So even if you're still in the same storyline, you're kind of switching between a couple POVs, and it doesn't take very long to understand who the POV is for that chapter. And generally speaking, those POV switches allow for some pretty effective story unraveling as well, which kind of goes on to my next point. Another thing that I really enjoyed about this book is that the way that reveals and kind of new information come about within the book is really great as a result of POV. There are portions where a specific chapter is explored from one particular character, and you're like, but why is this from this character instead of this character? And you kind of realize why, because there's an event that happens in that chapter that's just like, okay, that makes sense to make it this character instead of that one. It kind of enhances the effect that's being gone for, or it accentuates the I guess kind of the ways that certain other characters have been affected in a particular scene. In the climax, that's kind of the case. You get to view certain characters from an external POV as something is happening rather than inside their own. In a couple of cases where it's like, okay, you just be retrotting the exact same ground if it were that same POV again, but instead you get to see that effect from outside. And like all of that kind of stuff is cool. I really enjoyed that. I enjoyed the twists and turns, the story, the fun twists and turns in the story that happen at pretty instantaneous intervals within the story. And this is also kind of as a result of the POV thing that I mentioned. Normally in an epic fantasy book of this type of style, you would have a much longer book, and you would have spent much longer within a lot of these scenes to kind of flesh out some of the travels and some of the journeys. But Philip recognizes that, like, hey, we've already explored this world before in the Adan trilogy. Some of this stuff we don't really need to have on the page. And you also have the fact that following the Adan trilogy, you have a period of peace throughout a large chunk of the world. So covering every step of some of these characters' journeys just kind of isn't necessary, because it's not like there's, oppositional forces at every turn kind of that you need to escape or whatever. It's like, no, much of this world is pretty easy and generally pretty smooth to travel through, so you don't need a whole ton of that on the page. And this shortness of the book also kind of goes along with this and allows for some of the storytelling to be a little bit more implicit. You have certain time jumps that kind of happen, and you just infer that, like, oh yeah, they got through this entire section, nothing real major came up, so none of it was on the page. And that is really, really cool. And the time jumps are never super large. You still have intervals with which you get to experience those characters. But again, kind of the way that Philip handles POV and time and kind of things like that, I enjoyed within the book. All of it was very refreshing. Unfortunately, there are some downsides to a couple of these decisions, so we'll talk about the bad here. Occasionally, While Darkness Gathers does fall a little bit into that, that cliche trap of telling over showing. Everybody says show, don't tell. And Philip does a good job at this most of the time, but as a result of the brevity, sorry, I don't know why I said the word that way. The brevity of While Darkness Gathers means that there are a couple of moments now and again within the book that occasionally lean towards telling a little bit more than showing, where it's a more explicitly expository in ways that feels slightly unnatural. But I was always willing to give the book the benefit of the doubt in those cases. It's noticeable, but I wasn't offended by any of it, because I understood how short the book is. It's like, oh yeah, this book is less than 300 pages. If all of this stuff was done in the most effective show versus tell kind of way, you might have a book that was like 50 or even more pages longer than it is, just on account of some of those very minor moments of like, okay, let's just get this information out there so that it's out there. And I think that that's okay for a short book like this. Relatedly, there are certain bouts of dialogue where, even though the characters are very real and natural, there are a couple of moments where dialogue is somewhat unnatural, unnatural as a result of being kind of overly expository or unnecessarily expository, like where it didn't strictly need to be that way, but it kind of was. That meant that there were some interactions that were a little bit more stilted than I would have liked. But again, on the note of brevity and, the kind of effect that has on a book like this, it feels pretty normal. Like, I don't imagine that much of anybody else could have told this story in this amount of time without facing the exact same problems. Like, I think it's just inherent to the fact that the book is so short. And like I said before, it's not really offensive anyway. Just don't be surprised that there are going to be a couple moments that feel stilted that way, and you'll be fine. That's definitely where my experience was at there. There are also ways in which the primary, I guess, antagonist technically of the book doesn't really satisfy. Like, that side of the plot kind of felt a little bit forced in its direction until the very end. Like, there's a particular antagonistic force. There's like technically 3 antagonistic forces, I guess in this book, depending on how you would count those. And one of those, I would argue, is the main one, so far as the main character is concerned anyway. And like I said, there are certain aspects about how this antagonistic force is kind of utilized throughout that feels a little bit forced until the very end, where like that confrontation makes sense, it's meaningful, it has an emotional impact. But some of the moments leading up to that point, it's just like, I'm not entirely sure what you're doing here, so you're just kind of going along for the ride, trying to trust the process, and it just feels a little bit strange. So there's that, I guess. And then one other thing that I think that might bother some readers is that there's an aspect of Stockholm Syndrome that appears in one of the plot lines that came pretty close to bothering me. And I think that some others are going to be a little bit more sensitive to that and maybe against it inherently. In the context of the story and by the back half of the book, I came to find it really good and actually really well handled. But at the sort of like buddings of that kind of happening, where you start to see that, it's like, I don't know about this one, Chief, what are you doing here? And then, like I said, it goes in a direction, it's like, no, that makes sense, I'm totally for that. But at the start of it, it might be a little bit worrying, and there might be people who just don't like it at all, and fair enough, I guess. But that's something that I thought I would note. As for the ugly, this is going to be a little bit more on the kind of external side of things, a hypothetical type of ugly, and that is that I genuinely kind of wonder what else Philip will do with Jormungand if he writes more stories in this world. I can't imagine that he would be super inclined to make a new fantasy world as deep as this one is, because I really enjoy the world of Jormungand. But without coming up with a new timeline or like setting whatever future stories he does here in an inherently different part of the timeline, like a couple hundred years in the future or in the past or whatever, I'm not entirely sure what else he could do with the story unless he does that. And even if he does do that, there's not very many moments of like, oh, I know like an idea that could happen a couple years or a couple hundred years in the future, and there's not certain aspects of the history here of the world that I can think of just off the top of my head and be like, I want to hear that story, like that prequel story from 500 years in the past. Like, there's not anything super inherent to Jormungand that makes it obvious what Philip could do in the future. Because both Adan and While Darkness Gathers have very similar type of narrative cruxes to them, kind of the thing that they're doing, and that similarity isn't going to work for any more of these stories, in my opinion, not after this one, because, well, it would start to feel repetitive. It would be like, okay, you've relied on this particular plot device a little bit too much, and, you know, doing it any more than these couple of times where it makes sense, it works, and it has its emotional effect. Any more than that, I feel like is going to feel forced and probably ineffective. So that's kind of where I'm sitting on that. I think that there are different kinds of stories that can be told in Jormungand, but the stakes inherently need to be different, and I have no idea what kind of stakes Philip would come up with for any of those. So yeah, we'll kind of see what happens there. I'm totally down for a new set of characters. I'm down to be able to see some of the regions that we haven't seen in these books quite as much. But I definitely feel like there's not much else to explore here in this relative period of the timeline without things starting to feel redundant and kind of overdone, if that makes sense. So the ugly is, I don't know what else Philip could do in Jormungand without retreading the same ground over and over again. So I'm kind of have some questions about that, but I would definitely be interested to see it. As for the recommendation, I think if you enjoyed Adan already, you should absolutely read this book. It's a pretty easy recommendation on that grounds. But I think the question is a little bit more about when you should read it. I think technically, Philip has said that this can be read standalone. I personally would not recommend that, however. I would definitely recommend reading this as a sequel to the Adan trilogy, and that is because every major plot element of the Adan trilogy is heavily spoiled in this book, and several aspects of what this book is doing in like its climax, for example, spoils everything about the Adan trilogy, like every important part about the Adan trilogy. And that would really significantly reduce the impact and the effect and how enjoyable the Adan trilogy is if you were to read this first before you go back to those. Like, again, you can technically read this separate. All of the important information is here, but because the important information is here and makes it so that you can read this by itself, that would, like I said, in my opinion, it would ruin the effect of the trilogy. So I definitely recommend that you read the trilogy before you read this. I think that both the trilogy and this book will have more impact and especially more emotional effect on you if you read those 3 books and then this one. So there you have it, another review in the books. Haha. It's been kind of a heck of a month getting some of these videos put together. I'll say August has been a little bit of a struggle to actually make videos for some reason. It's taken twice as long to get any of these things out as I would typically hope that I've been able to do. I'm pretty happy with the output and the quality of the output this month, but it has taken a long time to work on certain videos on account of certain back-end projects that I'm having to balance with them. But again, I'm kind of happy with the output, and I hope that you guys are as well, that you enjoyed this video. I also encourage you guys, kind of like I said at the beginning of this video, to check out the second channel for non-book stuff. I believe tomorrow, if not last week, but probably tomorrow, will be a review of Expedition 33 coming out on the second channel. So if anybody's played that game, I have hopefully what I perceive to be my own unique take on that game, my own angle with which that I approach analyzing that game, that I hope will be worth viewing. So if you're interested in that, or any other music or gaming or film, TV related type of stuff, anything I do in those spaces go on the second channel. So if you want to check that out, I would encourage you to do that. On the main channel, however, things are going to be a little bit more kind of doing it as it comes up. For the next little while. Prepare for a diary video on the first half of Don Quixote this Thursday. The next month, I'll be reading the 10th book of Wheel of Time, I'm pretty sure. My plan is to read through all of that and going to be finishing not Disquiet Gods, Don Quixote at the same time, reading those kind of side by side, which means that the next, honestly, probably 6 Thursdays, if I'm not mistaken, are all going to be reading diary related, so that's something that'll be a little bit interesting. If you have fun or interesting book-related ideas, shout some of those out below. I would greatly appreciate that. I don't, at this point, have any book reviews that I think I can even do for September, so I have 3 or 4 September videos that I'm just going to have to figure out, and I don't know what secondary book topics I have that I'm very happy with that I would want to cover. So if you have any good or interesting ideas that I haven't done before, again, shout those out in the comments below. I would greatly appreciate that. Either way, I appreciate you guys for watching. For now, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.